Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. The house in Salford didn't look like a crime scene from the street. Semi-detached, close to the river, the kind of place where weekdays blur into school runs and late shifts. Inside, the air told a different story. Heat had lifted soot in a tight spiral on bathroom tile. A small, controlled patch of burning had licked at the room and then died. On the sink sat a wristwatch that had stopped sometime after midnight. The pattern didn't shout chaos. It suggested intention. Responders followed protocol. Perimeter first, entry points documented, utilities confirmed safe, then scene-by-scene photography. There were no signs of a prolonged fire. That mattered. A large, destructive blaze erases answers. A limited burn often means someone tried to hide them. The body of a 36-year-old woman, Clare Wood, was recovered in that bathroom. The initial working note was careful, heat damage present, cause of death undetermined. That line would change only when the post-mortem landed. When it did, it said what the room had been whispering. Strangulation. The burning came after. This is the United Kingdom, not the United States. No 911 call here. Neighbors had reported odor and smoke days earlier, then quiet. Officers canvassed the block. Who last saw her alive? When did her phone go dark? What time did routine stop looking like routine? A tight timeline began to take shape, final messages late in the weekend, a silence that bled into Monday, discovery on February 2, 2009. Forensics worked in layers. Soot vectors were traced to confirm the ignition locus. Any accelerant signatures would be logged if present, negative results would be logged the same way. Entry points were checked for tool marks. A careful sweep documented items missing or out of place, phones, keys, anything that usually lives on a hallway table and suddenly doesn't. In rooms like this, the task isn't to solve a murder in an hour. It's to preserve every durable fact that won't change tomorrow. Parallel to the lab work came the person. Claire wasn't a headline, she was a mother. Friends described a recent stretch of anxiety and unresolved conflict. Police would later confirm that in the months before her death she had made multiple reports, harassment, threats, criminal damage, even a sexual assault attempt, calls that flagged escalating risk. Those reports weren't a twist, they were a map. But a map is only useful if it's read in time. By afternoon, the posture was clear, single scene, probable homicide, concealment behavior indicated by a post-mortem fire. The offender profile narrowed to someone with access and familiarity, not random opportunism. The tone inside the house matched the tone in the briefing room, measured, precise, and a little too neat. An investigator wrote one line that stuck, the data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. If you're watching from a quiet street thousands of miles away, this is the part where you notice how ordinary everything looks. That's the point. In towns like this, murders aren't just crimes, they tear at the fabric of the routine that keeps people feeling safe. Claire's home should have been one of those routines. Instead, it became the first, and only, homicide scene in this case. There won't be a second. Clare Wood was 36, a mother, and by all accounts trying to stabilize a life that had been under pressure. The point of this section isn't to speculate about personality, it's to understand risk. Investigators built a profile from verifiable sources, prior police reports, call logs, and accounts from people who saw her in the weeks before she died. Those inputs are more than background, they establish what was known, when it was known, and how quickly that information moved. The record shows multiple contacts with police in the months leading to February 2009. The categories are clear: harassment, threats, criminal damage, and an attempted sexual assault. Dates, CAD numbers, and brief narrative lines exist for each report. They map a pattern of escalating control and fear. Anyone looking for melodrama here won't find it. What matters is that these reports form an objective history. When a later homicide occurs, that history is no longer a sidebar, it's a context that can explain access, motive, and timing. Friends described a shift in routine. Claire kept working, kept parenting, but her phone habits changed. More blocks, more ignored calls, a tighter circle of contacts. This isn't gossip, it's observable behavior corroborated by device records. Investigators noted time windows when her phone stopped transmitting routine data and periods when she avoided specific numbers. The purpose isn't to paint a mood. It's to understand whether she was isolating for safety, whether she feared being tracked, and whether any protective steps, changing locks, varying routes, were attempted. Safeguarding actions were reviewed. Had she been advised about safety planning? Was there a panic alarm, a marker on the address, or a restraining order application proceeding through the system? These are procedural questions with concrete answers, and they carry weight because they show where process met reality. In towns like this, people assume help arrives in straight lines. It does not. Systems are made of forms, shift changes, and competing priorities. That isn't an excuse, it's the field conditions. The post-mortem would later confirm strangulation and a limited, post-mortem burn at the home. That fact reframes the pre-incident reports. Strangulation in domestic contexts is a known red flag. It often occurs on a continuum that starts with surveillance and control. The earlier reports, threats, property damage, fit that trajectory. From a case-building standpoint, this narrows hypotheses towards someone with prior proximity and confidence about entry. It does not point to a name here, it only refines the model of who we're looking for and why. Interview notes from people close to Clare are concise. They describe recent anxiety, boundary setting after a breakup, and concerns that weren't fully resolved. The language is careful. Memory under stress is imperfect. Investigators cross-checked claims against phone records and the timing of previous police contacts. Where stories diverged, the file marks it. Where they lined up with hard data, the weight increased. The goal wasn't to collect emotion. It was to reduce uncertainty about the 72 hours before discovery. With the victimology established, the next operational step was to examine access. Who had keys? Who knew routines? Who had previously been warned off? That's not a witch hunt. It's a necessary filter when the scene shows no prolonged struggle, no ransack, and a concealment attempt after death. The small burn isn't theatrics, it's a signal. Someone wanted to limit what the room could say. People who know a victim's space can attempt that. Strangers rarely risk the time. For viewers following along, this is where the case becomes uncomfortable because it moves from the idea of random harm to targeted control. It's also where a different kind of accountability begins, procedural, not just personal. Clare's reports mattered then, and they matter now. When we read them as entries in a log, they can feel detached. When we line them up beside a post-mortem finding of strangulation, they describe a path that should be recognized faster the next time. The human part is simple. People ask for help because they want to live. Systems owe them speed and clarity. The data still look neat. Neat is not always good. A clean timeline can hide the one contact that matters, the one door left unlocked, the one message that wasn't returned. That's why the team pushed for more cross-checks before naming anyone publicly, device gaps, address markers, past calls for service, and the chain of initial responding officers on each prior report. If we're going to claim certainty later, the work has to justify it now. The case moved next to clockwork. Investigators built a clean timeline covering the weekend before February 2nd, 2009, and locked it with sources that don't change, phone activity, messaging records, neighbors' accounts taken the same day, and the first sweep of nearby premises that might hold usable footage. The purpose wasn't to dramatize absence, it was to mark the last points where Clare was unquestionably alive and routine still looked like routine. Late in the weekend, her phone showed normal use, short texts to a friend about errands, a missed call she did not return, and a brief outgoing call that connected. Nothing in those minutes raised an alert. Then the pattern narrowed. Messages went unanswered. Regular background data from the device, the kind that rides along with ordinary use, slowed and then cut out. That moment, combined with what the scene team saw upstairs, defined a probable window for the assault and the fire setting that followed. The language in the file is plain. The phone fell silent before discovery. No activity resumed. Officers worked the immediate area for corroboration. Several neighbors were home over the weekend. One recalled a faint, unusual odor that didn't match cooking or routine household smells. Another noticed nothing until Monday. Both statements were taken and timestamped. Neither was treated as more than what they are, limited human recollections that point to a time frame, not a precise hour. Door-to-door checks confirmed no reports of loud arguments, visible break-in attempts, or unfamiliar vehicles lingering. It doesn't mean there weren't any. It means none were observed or reported in that interval. Bank records and card use were checked for activity. There were no purchases after the last confirmed messages. That finding added weight to the idea that Clare never left the house to resume ordinary tasks and that routine halted in place. Investigators also screened for any taxi bookings, ride requests, or transit card taps in her name. None appeared within the relevant window. When you remove movement, you focus on access, who could enter, who expected to be admitted, and who knew the layout well enough to move quickly without leaving obvious chaos behind. The first pass at entry points found no clear signs of forced entry. That is not a conclusion, it's a condition of the scene as documented. Locks and frames were photographed. Any microdamage would be assessed later by specialists. But the lack of an obvious breach changed the working questions. If no one smashed their way in and nothing was obviously staged to look like a burglary, then this was likely someone who could be inside without drawing attention at the door, either through permission, familiarity, or timed entry when no one else was around to notice. Detectives matched the device cutoff with the neighbor's earliest references to odor and with the watch found at the sink that had stopped sometime after midnight. Each data point by itself is weak. Together, they closed the nightly window tightly enough for the post-mortem to matter more. Consistency across independent sources is the goal. It doesn't produce a name, but it reduces the space in which a name can move. The working note from the lead, the weekend timeline is cleaner than average and should be treated with care because cleanliness can hide the one irregularity that matters. Friends supplied context to fill in the hours before silence. Clare had described holding boundaries after a breakup, changing how she answered calls, and trying to keep her routine predictable for her child. Those details were not used to create drama. They were used to explain why certain incoming numbers were ignored and why last-minute plan changes would have stood out. The team flagged any person who had previously been turned away, warned off, or linked to earlier reports. That was not a public designation, it was a private filter that determined who needed to be interviewed promptly once the post-mortem came back. The final step in this phase was to align the timeline with the limited burn upstairs. Fire investigators confirmed it didn't spread far. That matters because a contained fire takes time to arrange and time to extinguish on its own. It also points toward someone who believed the burn would complicate later analysis but still chose not to ignite the entire property. In cases like this, restraint isn't mercy. It's a risk calculation. It tells you something about confidence and familiarity. This is where the narrative usually strains for speculation. We won't. The truth is more useful. A woman's life stopped between a short set of weekend touchpoints and a Monday discovery. Her phone went quiet. Her house produced a single scene. Nothing in the record shows a frantic escape, a chase, or an unknown intruder punching past locks. The most likely path remains the simplest: access, opportunity, and a decision made behind a door that should have been safe. In towns like this, that conclusion hurts because it's ordinary, and because ordinary can be missed until it is too late. The post-mortem settled what the room only suggested. The pathologist's report identified manual strangulation as the cause of death, with injuries consistent with pressure to the neck and associated findings that appear when blood flow and air are cut off. No single line in the document is sensational. It is a sequence of observations that, taken together, move the case from probable to confirmed. Time of death was estimated within the same overnight window already indicated by the phone's final activity and the neighbor's earliest notes. That alignment mattered. It meant the science and the timeline spoke the same language. There were no catastrophic injuries elsewhere on the body, no evidence of a sustained fight that traveled room to room. That does not mean there was no struggle, it means what happened was controlled and fast. Fingernail scrapings and trace collection were done as standard practice. Toxicology was taken, not to find a scandal but to eliminate unknowns that could confuse the sequence. The results did not alter the central finding. Strangulation is intimate and often executed by someone who knows the environment. In a small house, noise carries, a prolonged brawl is hard to hide. This wasn't that. The limited fire, already documented by scene techs, was confirmed as post-mortem. Material damage was localized, consistent with an attempt to degrade evidence rather than destroy a structure. Investigators were careful not to oversell what a small burn can do. It can blur certain traces, but it cannot erase the core story when cause of death is mechanical and visible. What the burn did tell them was intent. Someone stayed long enough after the assault to stage a barrier against later analysis. That takes nerve, or time, or both. Entry points were revisited with the autopsy in hand. If no obvious forced entry was present and the assault likely occurred within a tight window, attention shifted to people who could be inside without breaking anything: key holders, former key holders, and anyone with routine access. The lack of widespread injury made the intruder who ransacks and runs scenario less likely. It supported a model where control was established quickly, possibly by surprise, possibly by a person whose presence was not immediately threatening at the door. The watch on the sink, stopped after midnight, remained a circumstantial marker, not a clock that decides the case. Still, when an object in the room lines up with phone silence and a medical estimate of death, it builds confidence in the window of time. Fire investigators added one more point: ignition occurred near surfaces that would limit spread. That choice reduced the risk of the fire taking the residence, but it also reduced the chance that the burn would defeat forensic review. In plain terms, it was a crude attempt at concealment, not a sophisticated one. Interviews were prioritized in light of the autopsy. Individuals previously flagged for boundary violations moved to the front of the line. The team requested fresh statements and corroborating alibis that crossed into the overnight window. Any account that relied on vague memory got tested against device pings, transit records, or simple questions about who saw whom and at what time. The process isn't dramatic, it's patient. In towns like this, routine hides and reveals at the same volume. You listen differently after you know how someone died. There was care taken with language. The report did not label anyone a killer. It did not assume a motive beyond what the mechanics suggest: control and concealment. It acknowledged what could not yet be fixed to a name and noted what could: time of death, method, staging. One line in the internal notes captured the caution: the data aligned with an access model. We should not let that alignment blind us to an outlier. It's a useful discipline in cases that feel straightforward. Straight lines can still curve where you're not looking. The human reality sits next to the clinical. A woman was killed in the place she lived, and someone tried to make analysis harder. The value for anyone watching is not a shock line, it's a prevention line. Strangulation is a known marker of escalating risk in intimate contexts. When it ends in homicide, you can often look back and see the steps that made it predictable. That doesn't provide comfort, but it does provide a checklist for systems and for people who are worried and uncertain about what to do next. With the autopsy concluded, the investigative posture sharpened. If the assault occurred inside a locked routine, and if the fire was contained and late, then the pool narrows to familiarity. That doesn't clear everyone else, it prioritizes. Next comes the step that moves a private filter into a public search, naming a person of interest and asking for help to find him when he does not show up to be interviewed. The autopsy tightened the window. The next move was access. Investigators treated the house like a circle and worked inward: locks, keys, routine, and anyone who could enter without force. The point wasn't to speculate about character, it was to document capability. If the scene showed control rather than chaos, the probability favored someone who knew the door, the layout, and the timing. Key control came first. Officers confirmed who officially held keys: Clare Wood, a family member who helped with childcare, and a spare kept for emergencies. The spare's location was verified and logged. No locksmith visits were recorded in the weeks before February 2009. Door hardware showed normal wear, frames and strike plates were photographed again under better light. Nothing obvious changed from the first pass, no splintering, no fresh tool marks, no pried latch. That didn't prove permission, it narrowed the pool to people who could be inside without attracting attention. Routine was next. Investigators reconstructed when Clare typically locked up, who she would let in late, and which friends or relatives had reason to stop by unannounced. These aren't personality questions, they're access questions. A pattern emerged. When she set boundaries after a breakup, drop-ins decreased. Calls from certain numbers went unanswered. Friends said she had started meeting people outside the home when possible. That shift aligned with the documented risk reports, not to dramatize fear, but to explain why an unexpected knock would have stood out. Safeguarding history was reviewed once more with access in mind. Had her address been marked for priority response? Was there a safety plan on file that advised against opening the door to specific individuals? Paper answers matter because they create expectations. If a plan existed, did it change how she handled evenings and weekends? If a plan did not exist yet, did she still try to live like one did, keeping visits short, keeping the circle small? The purpose was not to assign blame after the fact. It was to understand the gap between advice and what a person can sustain day after day. Interview teams moved quickly. Key holders and close contacts were asked to account for whereabouts inside the overnight window. Alibis were checked against simple anchors: who saw you, when, and in what setting. Phone location data, transit taps, and workplace logs supported or contradicted those accounts. The standard was not drama, it was consistency. Vague answers were not rejected outright, but they were flagged for a second look when the dataset allowed it. People who had previously been warned off, formally or informally, moved to the front of the queue. The question of entry without force remained live. In many homes, a door can be opened quietly with a key that hasn't been surrendered or with one that was duplicated while a relationship was stable. Investigators canvassed local key-cutting shops for recent orders tied to the street or surname. Most shops had no relevant records, the few that did produced generic logs without names. That result didn't clear anyone. It simply meant the case could not rely on a receipt to tell the story. The story would have to come from timing, proximity, and statements set against the digital traces already collected. Neighbors were asked a narrow set of questions on a second pass. Did anyone notice a visitor who walked straight to the door as if they'd been there many times? Did anyone hear a short exchange rather than an argument? In controlled homicides, the noise is often in seconds, not minutes. 2 residents recalled a quick knock-and-enter rhythm comment on the block, no raised voices, no prolonged conversation, on the night before discovery. The descriptions were too general to name a person. They were specific enough to maintain the access model over the forced entry alternative. Inside the file, risk indicators were given practical weight. Prior threats, the move to block calls, and the tighter routine supported a simple theory: the person most likely to gain entry was one who had previously had it, or who believed they still had the right to it. That isn't a declaration, it's a filter. When combined with the medical finding of strangulation in a small space and a short window, it pointed investigators toward interviews that could not wait. The working note was spare: access plus motive does not equal proof, access plus motive plus opportunity begins to look like it. There is a human line here that matters and doesn't sensationalize. Boundaries are easy to recommend and hard to maintain. People have jobs, children, schedules they can't tear up every week. When risk escalates, routines do not always keep pace, and doors that once opened out of habit can open again out of habit. The value in telling it plainly is not to assign fault. It is to map the decision points where systems and people need more support than they often get. With the access picture tightened, the team prepared the next step. Interviews would continue, but the case needed external pressure, a public request to locate a specific individual who had not made themselves available to speak. The language would be cautious and factual. The timing would reflect urgency. And the search grid would start where the routine ended, near the house, along known routes, and across the places someone familiar with Salford could disappear for days. When a homicide happens inside a home and the facts align this cleanly, time window, access model, and cause, the next tool isn't another swab, it's the paperwork. Detectives pulled every prior call for service tied to Clare Wood and built a sequence: date, allegation type, officer response, and follow-up. The intent wasn't to relitigate the past. It was to determine what risk was documented, what actions were advised, and where the gaps sat between warnings and outcomes. The internal review moved on two rails. One team stayed on the criminal inquiry, interviews, alibis, and a pending public appeal for a person of interest. The second team prepared materials for external scrutiny, the kind that audits police decisions against policy. In the United Kingdom, this lands with the Independent Police Complaints Commission, an arm's-length look at whether the earlier harassment and threat reports were assessed and acted upon in a way that matched the risk. The terms are dry, the stakes are not. If risk was graded too low, the case carries a systems problem as well as an offender. The prior reports were specific: harassment, threats to harm, criminal damage, and attempted sexual assault allegation. Each entry carried a short narrative and a box tick: advice given, action taken, or referral made. The audit asked straightforward questions. Was the pattern recognized as escalation? Did the address receive an updated marker? Were safety plans proposed and recorded? Was an offender risk matrix refreshed after each incident, or did earlier entries sit untouched while new ones arrived? These aren't rhetorical. They map whether a person who kept asking for help was met with a process that could keep pace. Supervisors reconstructed decision points. When a threat is reported, the clock starts. Did follow-up calls land within the target window? If a suspect violated boundaries, was the breach documented in a way that increased monitoring or intervention? None of this tells you who strangled Clare. It tells you how much protective posture surrounded her before the night the phone went silent. For investigators, that context is practical. A history of enforcement wobble can embolden an offender. It can also forecast how quickly a suspect might escalate after a breakup. One finding aligned with common domestic abuse dynamics: risk does not sit still, it spikes around separation. The paper trail showed exactly that: more contacts, tighter boundaries, and a move to ignore specific numbers. The audit didn't assign blame to the victim for maintaining routine. It noted the reality most people live in: jobs, children, obligations that don't pause because a threat is on paper. The human line matters here, and it's short: people call because they want to live. Systems exist to make that call count. Inside debriefings, the tone sharpened. With cause of death confirmed and entry likely achieved without force, the access model held. The paperwork added weight to one path: someone with prior proximity, a history of control, and a willingness to test boundaries. That is not a conviction, it is a priority. Interviews were reordered accordingly. Individuals referenced in the earlier reports, and any person informally warned off, moved to the top for recontact and hard alibi checks. When someone with that profile doesn't attend for interview on a case like this, you don't wait. You prepare to name them. The audit team also looked ahead. Whatever the outcome of this homicide, the case would become a reference point for disclosure policy: how the public can ask about a partner's violent past and how police can disclose it to prevent harm. That future chapter belongs later. But in the room, the connection was clear: a woman made multiple, specific reports, a homicide followed, and the next decisions would balance due process with the public safety interest in finding one individual now. In towns like this, accountability feels abstract until you look at the timestamps. Then it's just a string of choices. Some were fast enough, some were not. The criminal case still needed one thing it didn't yet have: the subject of the risk reports, in a chair, answering questions. When that didn't happen, the paperwork and the evidence met at the same conclusion: the investigation had to go public. The case moved from rooms and reports to the street. With cause, timeline, and access now aligned, detectives made a focused decision: go public. Greater Manchester Police named George Appleton, a former partner of Clare Wood, as a person of interest wanted urgently for interview. The language in the appeal was precise: no verdicts, no theories, just a description, recent images, last known addresses in Salford, and a request for sightings. When an individual central to earlier risk reports doesn't attend, you don't wait for convenience, you start the clock in the open. Operationally, a public appeal is not a press stunt, it's a deployment. A search grid spun out from Clare's home and the places Appleton frequented: bus corridors, canal paths, derelict buildings, footbridges, the edges of retail parks where cameras sometimes catch faces at the margins. Teams checked hostels and B&Bs that accept cash, asked at pubs where staff remember regulars, and revisited addresses tied to him through prior calls for service. Patrol officers carried the appeal on briefings. Transit police were looped in. One control room handled tips to avoid duplication. The first 24 hours brought volume, not clarity. A clerk thought he'd seen Appleton near a takeaway. Timestamp didn't hold. Someone swore they saw him on a bus toward Manchester city centre. Camera angles missed the seat. Tips like these aren't useless. They set the rhythm and tell you whether the subject is moving boldly or hiding in plain sight. Here, the signal suggested local, not distant. The distances were short, the routes familiar. In towns like this, a person can disappear for days by staying within a few square miles and changing only where he sleeps. Social media turned the appeal into a constant scroll. The Facebook fugitive tag took off fast, an unhelpful nickname to investigators but useful as distribution. The more people who recognized him, the more places he could not walk into without a second look. Officers pushed stills that showed features clearly under daylight and low light, knowing the most valuable sighting is the one that gives you a timestamp you can verify. A handful of calls pointed to derelict sites, and used pubs, empty flats, rooms where someone could hang back until night. Those locations went from possible to priority. Daily briefings were short and direct. Where had canvases been completed? Which cameras were now feeding live to a designated hub? Which tips repeated the same rumor in different words? The line from the investigative lead stayed disciplined: don't let volume replace verification. 1,000 mentions of a rumor are still one rumor. Search teams doubled back to specific buildings, not because it looked cinematic but because people return to what they know. You check bin stores and stairwells twice, you check rooftops when the weather holds. By day 3 the pattern hardened. Appleton was not using his bank card. No legitimate payroll hits, no formal accommodation. That narrowed things to short-term couches and unused spaces. Officers requested assistance from neighboring forces to watch likely exit points and second-line transport, local trains, night buses, and towpaths where cyclists sometimes pass at speed and catch a face in a helmet cam. Nothing firm yet. The absence of transactional data can tempt you to call it a dead end. It isn't. It's a lane marker. The subject is living on scraps, not systems. Community calls mattered in a different way. People asked if they were safe to move around. The message back was practical: keep routines, stay observant, and report sightings with exact locations and times. It's not about fear, it's about narrowing a map. The human piece in cases like this is simple: a neighborhood wants closure, not spectacle. The case file wants the same thing, just with timestamps. On day 5, the search refocused sharply on derelict premises in Salford identified by recurring tips and prior knowledge, places Appleton had been known to drift through. Officers coordinated discreet entries with safety in mind, aware that desperation can turn a small space into a dangerous one quickly. The appeal stayed up, the phone line stayed open, and the grid closed one building at a time. The investigation had moved from a house to a city and now down to specific doors. The next development would answer the one question the case could not defer any longer: where is he? 5 days into the public appeal, the search narrowed to disused premises around Salford, places familiar to a man trying to avoid contact and cameras. Officers made coordinated entries with clear roles and a single aim: locate the person of interest alive and bring him in. In one derelict building tied to prior sightings, they found George Appleton, deceased by hanging. A later inquest recorded suicide. That building was a recovery location, not a second crime scene. The homicide remained where we began, Clare Wood's home. One case, one ending. The operational posture changed in an instant. With the only named subject dead, there would be no interview, no charge, no trial. The file closed as homicide with offender deceased. What remained was to document the last movements accurately, notify next of kin, and audit the casework against policy. That audit wasn't theater. It was a practical map of what was known before the murder, what actions followed, and how procedures handled persistent reports of harassment and threats in the months leading to February 2009. Clare's father, Michael Brown, refused to let the paper trail end as a private grief. He campaigned for a clear route for people to ask police about a partner's history of violence and for police to disclose relevant risk information when it could protect life. The policy that followed, known widely as Clare's Law, formerly the Domestic Violence Disclosure Scheme, DVDS, took a simple principle and put it into process: right to ask. A member of the public requests information about a current or ex-partner, and right to know. Police proactively share risk information when lawful and necessary to prevent harm. DVDS moved from pilots to national rollout across England and Wales in 2014, and guidance has continued to be refined through to the present. It doesn't replace arrests, restraining orders, or safety planning. It adds an earlier checkpoint, one that can surface patterns, prior assaults, stalking, controlling behavior, before those patterns escalate beyond a safe exit. That's the lasting legacy of this case, turning documented risk into usable knowledge while balancing privacy and protection under law. The human part matters, even in a report written for clarity. Clare would ask for help more than once. She followed the path available to her at the time. The system now offers another tool because people around her insisted the lessons be learned publicly. The message isn't blame. It's preparedness. If something feels wrong, record it, report it, and, where DVDS is available, ask. For friends and family, it's equally direct. Take disclosures seriously, help the person document risk, support practical steps that are difficult to sustain alone. We end where we must, with a single, consistent resolution and a policy born from it. There is no second scene, no alternate suspect, no competing finish. A woman was killed in her home. The named offender died by suicide days later, and the law that carries her name is meant to make the next warning louder, sooner. In towns like Salford, and every town that recognizes the pattern, murders don't just end lives, they test the systems built to save them. This one changed the system. I've walked you through one home, one timeline, one ending. What stays with me is how warning signs stack quietly until they turn deadly. In the U.S., we act early, document, tell someone, and use what your city offers, disclosure checks, safety plans, restraining orders, before fear becomes crisis. If something here helped, tell me what hit hardest, or where you're watching from. If you disagree, say why. I read every comment. Share this with someone who needs a nudge to set boundaries. And if this story moved you, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next case. Your awareness could save a life.